In the mist-shrouded valleys of the Carpathian Mountains, there exists a terror far older than the polished aristocrat we know as Dracula. This is not the tale of a Victorian gentleman vampire with his refined castle and elegant cape. This is something infinitely more primal, more intimate, and far more terrifying. This is the story of a creature that emerged from the very soil of Romania itself, born not from the imagination of a British author, but from the deepest fears of a people who lived with death as their closest neighbour. Before Bram Stoker ever put pen to paper, before Hollywood ever cast its first count, the villages of old Romania whispered a different name in the darkness. They spoke of the Strigoi, and they spoke of it with a dread that came not from fiction, but from terrible, lived experience. What you are about to discover will fundamentally change how you understand the vampire myth. Because this is not a story about monsters lurking in distant castles. This is a story about your neighbour, your family member, your loved one who refused to stay dead. And if you think you know what a vampire truly is, prepare to have everything you believed torn apart and rebuilt from the ground up. My name is Vanishing Legends, and we explore the forgotten stories that shaped our deepest fears. If you are fascinated by the dark folklore that lies beneath our modern myths, then you absolutely need to subscribe to this channel, because we are going on a journey into the shadows of history that most people never dare to explore. Today, we are not just telling you about Romania's original vampire. We are reconstructing an entire worldview, a way of understanding life and death that governed these mountain communities for centuries. We are going to witness the birth of a legend that would eventually conquer the world. But in its original form, it was something far more complex, far more human, and infinitely more haunting than anything Hollywood has ever produced. But here is what makes this story truly extraordinary. The Strigoi was not just a monster. It was a diagnosis, a way for an entire culture to make sense of the inexplicable tragedies that befell their communities. It was their answer to the question that has haunted humanity since we first began burying our dead. What happens when those we love refuse to let go? To understand the true horror of the Strigoi, we must journey back to a time before electric lights banished the darkness, before modern medicine explained away the mysteries of death and disease. We must enter a world where the boundary between the living and the dead was not a wall, but a veil so thin it could be torn with a whisper. This is the world of medieval Romania, where every death was a potential horror, every grave a possible gateway, and every family lived in constant fear that their greatest tragedy might be only the beginning of their nightmare. But the story of the Strigoi does not begin with death. It begins with birth, with the moment a child first draws breath, and the terrible omens that could mark them for a fate worse than death itself. In the folklore of old Romania, your destiny as a vampire was not determined by a bite or a curse. It was written in the stars, sealed by the circumstances of your birth, and carried with you like a shadow for your entire life. Picture this: a woman in labor in a small mountain village, surrounded by flickering candlelight and the worried faces of midwives who know far more than they wish they did about the dark forces that govern this world. The child is born, and in that moment of what should be pure joy, the midwife sees something that fills her with dread. The baby's head is covered by a thin, translucent membrane, a caul, a piece of the amniotic sac that has clung to the child like a delicate shroud. In our modern world, this is a harmless biological quirk, occurring in perhaps 1 in 80,000 births. But in the world of Romanian folklore, this caul was no accident of nature. It was a sign, a mark, a fragment of the other world that had attached itself to the child. The midwife would carefully remove this membrane, knowing that if even a piece of it were to be accidentally swallowed by the infant, the child's dark fate would be sealed forever. They would become strigoi. But the call was not the only omen to be feared. In the mystical numerology of these mountain communities, certain numbers held immense and dangerous power. The number 7, sacred in so many traditions, carried with it a terrible burden in Romanian folklore. A 7th son, born in an unbroken line of 7 sons, was believed to possess a supernatural gift that was also a curse. This child would have the power of second sight, the ability to heal certain ailments, but they would also be born with something far more sinister, a second soul. This additional spirit, often taking the form of an animal, would grant the 7th son special abilities during their lifetime. But upon their death, it was this restless second soul that would refuse to depart, that would animate their corpse and transform them into one of the undead. The gift that made them special in life would doom them in death. And so from the moment of their first breath, these marked children lived under a cloud of suspicion and dread. The village would watch them, study them, searching for signs of the darkness that was believed to fester within their souls. Every unexplained illness, every failed harvest, every piece of misfortune could potentially be laid at their door. They were living reminders of the supernatural forces that govern this world, walking omens of the horror that was to come. But a child's fate was not always sealed by the circumstances of their birth. Sometimes, it was determined by the sins or simple neglect of their parents. In a devoutly Christian society, the sacrament of baptism was seen as essential for the protection of a soul. An unbaptized child who died was considered to be trapped in spiritual limbo, their soul unable to find rest in heaven and dangerously vulnerable to being claimed by evil forces. These unbaptized dead were prime candidates for returning as strigoi, their unprotected souls easy prey for the malevolent forces that lurked in the shadows between worlds. Similarly, a child born out of wedlock carried the spiritual stain of their parents' sin throughout their lives. Already considered to be living outside the bounds of God's law, such children were natural suspects when supernatural troubles began to plague a community. This created a terrible cycle of fear and suspicion. Children marked by these omens lived their entire lives as outsiders, watched and whispered about, never fully accepted by their communities. And when death finally claimed them, the very suspicion that had followed them in life would ensure that their graves would be the first to be examined when unexplained horrors began to unfold. But the threat of the strigoi was not something that only manifested after death. In the complex mythology of these mountain villages, there were also the strigoi sea, the living vampires. These were not monsters in human form, but ordinary people, neighbors, and family members who were believed to possess dark supernatural powers even while they walked among the living. The primary ability attributed to these living vampires was a form of psychic parasitism that was both subtle and devastating. They could steal the mana, the life essence, from everything around them. A strigoi vei could drain the milk from a neighbor's cow with nothing more than an envious glance, leaving the animal dry and useless. They could steal the fertility from fertile fields, causing crops to wither and die without explanation. Most terrifyingly of all, they could drain the strength and vitality from healthy people, leaving them weak, listless, and wasting away, all without ever laying a physical hand upon their victims. This belief made the living strigoi the perfect explanation for the random cruelties and inexplicable misfortunes of rural life. When drought struck and crops failed, when animals sickened and died, when healthy people began to waste away for no apparent reason, the community had an answer. Somewhere among them walked a living vampire, and until that person was identified and dealt with, the suffering would continue. But perhaps the most fascinating aspect of the living strigoi was their nocturnal activities. It was believed that on certain powerful nights of the year, nights when the veil between worlds grew thin, the spirit of a living vampire could separate from their physical body. This detached soul, often taking the form of an animal, would then travel incredible distances to meet with other strigoi spirits in remote locations. These gatherings were not social events, but battlefields. The disembodied spirits would engage in fierce spectral combat, fighting one another with improvised weapons, spindles from weaving looms, scythe blades, or simple wooden clubs. The outcome of these invisible wars was believed to determine the fate of entire villages for the coming year. A good harvest or famine, prosperity or ruin, health or plague, all decided by secret battles fought by the sleeping souls of their neighbours. The living walked among monsters, and they never knew which face in the crowd might belong to one of the undead. This invisible threat living in their midst demanded constant vigilance from the villagers of old Romania. They could not simply hope and pray that the living vampires would leave them in peace. They had to actively defend themselves, their families, and their livelihoods against neighbours whose very existence posed a supernatural danger. The arsenal of protection they developed over centuries was both practical and mystical, a complex system of folk magic that blended ancient pagan traditions with Christian symbolism. At the heart of this defensive network was the most famous vampire deterrent known to the world: garlic. But in its original context, garlic was far more than just a simple herb hanging in a kitchen. It was a weapon, a shield, a sacred barrier against the forces of darkness. Villagers would weave thick braids of garlic bulbs and hang them above their doorways, creating an aromatic barrier that no strigoi could cross. They would rub fresh cloves directly onto window frames, door handles, and even the horns of their cattle, marking everything they valued with this pungent protection. Some would consume raw garlic daily, believing that it would make their very blood toxic to any vampire foolish enough to attempt to feed upon them. But garlic was only the beginning. The sign of the cross, carved into door frames or traced in the air, carried the full power of Christian faith against the creatures of the night. Sacred incense, burned in small braziers throughout the home, would purify the air itself of malevolent influences. Thorny branches of wild rose were scattered on windowsills, their sharp points designed to snag and trap any wandering spirit that might attempt to enter. And perhaps most cleverly, millet seeds were spread across doorsteps and around the perimeter of homes, relying on an ancient belief that vampires were compelled to stop and count every single grain, keeping them occupied until the safety of dawn arrived. This constant state of supernatural warfare reached its absolute peak on the night of St. Andrew, November 30th, when the barriers between the world of the living and the world of the dead were believed to be at their thinnest. On this night, the strigoi were at their most powerful, their most dangerous, and their most active. Entire villages would essentially go into lockdown, families barricading themselves inside their homes and performing elaborate protective rituals that had been passed down through countless generations. Every door would be anointed with garlic oil. Every window would be sealed with crosses carved from sacred wood. Even the chimneys would be protected, stuffed with thorny branches to prevent spirits from descending through them. All pots, pans, and tools would be turned upside down so that wandering souls could not hide inside them or use them for their own malevolent purposes. It was a night when the entire community united in a single shared terror, bound together by their collective need to survive until morning. But all of these protections, elaborate as they were merely defensive measures. They were designed to ward off the living strigoi and their wandering souls, creatures that were still bound, however loosely, to physical mortal bodies. The true nightmare, the horror that kept these mountain communities awake at night, was reserved for what would happen when those bodies finally died, and the malevolent spirits within them were set completely free. Death, in the worldview of medieval Romania, was not a single moment, but a complex process filled with supernatural dangers. There was a profound and critical difference between what they called a good death and a bad death. And this distinction would determine not just how a person was remembered, but whether they would find peace in the afterlife or return to torment the living. A good death was one that followed the natural order of things. It meant dying in one's own bed, surrounded by loving family members, having received the last rites of the church and made peace with both God and one's fellow human beings. A soul that departed under these blessed circumstances was believed to find immediate rest, to journey peacefully to whatever afterlife awaited them, without any desire or ability to return to the world of the living. But a bad death was a violation of the cosmic order, a tearing of the fabric that separated life from death. The most feared of these unnatural endings was death by suicide. To take one's own life was seen as the ultimate rejection of God's gift, a final act of despair that left the soul in a state of profound spiritual turmoil. Such people were denied burial in the consecrated ground of the churchyard. Instead, they were often interred at crossroads outside the village limits, their unhallowed graves serving as gateways between worlds. Their restless, tormented spirits were considered almost certain to return, driven by the same despair that had led them to end their lives. Murder victims, whose lives had been violently ripped away before their appointed time, might also become strigoi, their unfinished business and desire for vengeance preventing them from finding peace. Travelers who died in accidents far from home, without proper burial rites or the comfort of family, could become wandering spirits, forever searching for the rest that had been denied them. But perhaps the most intimate and terrifying threat came from those who died with powerful earthly emotions still burning in their hearts. A person who died consumed by bitter hatred, nursing deep grudges against family members or neighbors, carrying the weight of perceived injustices and betrayals, could not pass peacefully into the next world. Their rage, their need for revenge, their inability to forgive or be forgiven, would bind their malevolent spirit to their corpse, animating it so they could crawl from their grave to seek terrible vengeance upon those they felt had wronged them in life. This created an atmosphere of constant social tension within these tight-knit communities. Every argument, every business dispute, every family feud carried the potential for supernatural consequences. People understood that their conflicts with others might not end with death, that a neighbor who died angry could return as something far worse than they had ever been in life. The period immediately following death was considered the most dangerous time of all. In Eastern European tradition, the soul was believed to linger for 40 days after the body's death, journeying through familiar places, revisiting important locations from its earthly life, before finally facing divine judgment. For a peaceful soul, this was a sacred pilgrimage, a final farewell to the physical world. But for a troubled or cursed soul, this 40-day window represented an opportunity to lose its way, to become trapped between worlds, to transform from a departed human being into something monstrous and predatory. The living, therefore, maintained an intense vigil during this critical period. The body would never be left alone before burial, with family members and friends taking shifts to ensure that it showed no signs of unnatural stirring. Mirrors throughout the house would be covered with black cloth, so that the wandering soul would not see its own reflection and become confused or trapped. Clocks would sometimes be stopped at the moment of death, symbolically halting time for the deceased and helping them to let go of their attachment to earthly concerns. When the time finally came for burial, the funeral rites themselves were filled with a kind of sacred paranoia, protective measures designed to ensure that the dead would remain dead. If there was even the slightest suspicion that the deceased might return as a strigoi, specific and powerful precautions would be taken. A stone or coin might be placed in the corpse's mouth to prevent it from chewing on its burial shroud, which was considered one of the earliest signs of vampiric activity. Sometimes the body would be buried face down, so that if it somehow managed to animate an attempt to dig its way out, it would only succeed in digging itself deeper into the earth, further away from the world of the living. For cases where the risk was considered especially high, more extreme measures were employed. A nail might be driven through the skull, pinning the head to the bottom of the coffin. A sickle, that curved blade used for harvesting grain, would be placed around the neck of the corpse, positioned so that any attempt to rise would result in decapitation. These were not acts of cruelty or desecration, but desperate insurance policies, final attempts to ensure that the natural order would be maintained and the dead would stay where they belonged. But sometimes, despite all these precautions, despite all the prayers and rituals and protective measures, the unthinkable would happen. The 40 days would pass, the funeral rites would be completed, the grave would be sealed and blessed, and still the signs would come. Still the family would begin to waste away with mysterious illnesses. Still the cattle would refuse to give milk. Still ghostly figures would be seen haunting the edges of the village at night. And the community would be forced to confront their worst nightmare. All their efforts had failed, and one of their own had returned from the grave as a monster. If you find yourself captivated by these ancient terrors, by the way our ancestors understood the thin line between life and death, then you need to subscribe to Vanishing Legends right now, because we have so much more to uncover in this dark journey through Romania's supernatural past. When all the sacred rituals failed, when all the protective measures proved insufficient, when the signs became undeniable, the transformation was complete. Deep beneath the earth, something stirred that should not stir. Something that was no longer bound by the natural laws that govern the living. The Strigoi Mor, the undead vampire, had awakened, and its hunger was absolute. Unlike the elegant aristocrat of Gothic fiction, the newly risen Strigoi was a creature of raw, primal hunger. It did not emerge from its grave with flowing cape and refined manners. It clawed its way through the packed earth with fingernails that had grown long and sharp in death. Its burial shroud torn and stained with the soil of its own violation. This was not a monster that lived in distant castles or foreign lands. This was your father, your husband, your child, transformed into something that remembered love only as a pathway to destruction. The Strigoi did not wander aimlessly through the night like some lost spirit seeking purpose. It was drawn by invisible threads to the places and people it had known in life, pulled by a twisted parody of the bonds that had once connected it to the living world. But these were no longer connections of affection or care. They had become chains of predation, pathways that led the monster directly to its most vulnerable prey. Its first destination was almost always its own home. But the creature that returned was not the person who had once lived there. It moved through walls as if they were mist, seeped through keyholes and cracks in the foundation, entered through chimneys like a malevolent smoke. The family sleeping peacefully in their beds had no warning, no chance to defend themselves against something that knew every corner of their home, every habit of their daily lives, every weakness in their defenses. The attack was not the dramatic bite to the neck that modern vampire fiction has made famous. Instead, it was something far more insidious, more psychologically devastating. The Strigoi would stand over the beds of its living family members, a silent, suffocating presence that drained life through proximity alone. The sleeping victim would feel an inexplicable weight pressing down upon their chest, a sensation of being slowly crushed by an invisible force. They would experience a terrifying paralysis, unable to move or cry out as their breath was literally stolen from their lungs. Some would awaken to find strange marks on their bodies, small bruises or scratches that had not been there when they went to sleep. Others would feel a single icy touch, a caress that left them shivering and weak for days afterward. But the most common experience was simply waking up feeling utterly drained, as if their very life force had been siphoned away during the night, leaving them pale, exhausted, and filled with an inexplicable dread that seemed to seep into their bones. This was not a single violent encounter, but the beginning of a prolonged haunting that would systematically destroy the family from within. Night after night, the strigoi would return, each visit leaving its victims a little weaker, a little more desperate, a little closer to joining their tormentor in the realm of the undead. The malevolence of the strigoi extended far beyond the walls of its former home. The creature's very existence was an affront to the natural order, and its presence radiated outward like a supernatural plague, corrupting everything it touched. In a world without any understanding of germ theory or viral transmission, when mysterious illnesses began spreading from house to house with no discernible pattern or cause, the villagers knew exactly what to suspect. The strigoi was believed to be a carrier of disease in the most literal sense, its corrupted essence capable of spreading sickness simply through its presence in the village. Some accounts describe the creature ringing the church bells at midnight, the sacred bronze contaminated by its unholy touch, sending waves of pestilence throughout the community with each ghostly toll. But the supernatural blight did not stop with human victims. The strigoi's rejection of the cosmic order brought chaos to nature itself. It could tie the rains, a phrase that meant binding the natural weather patterns through dark magic, causing devastating droughts that would parch the fields and kill the livestock. It could summon hailstorms in the middle of summer, calling down ice from clear skies to shatter the harvest and destroy months of backbreaking agricultural work. The very fertility of the land was believed to be at the mercy of these creatures. Crops would wither without explanation when a strigoi walked through the fields. Wells would run dry when the monster passed nearby. Even the wild animals of the forest would flee the area, sensing the wrongness that emanated from the undead like a toxic cloud. This transformation of a personal family tragedy into a community-wide crisis meant that the strigoi was no longer just a private sorrow to be endured in silence. It had become a public enemy, a cancer at the heart of the village that threatened the health of their children, the lives of their animals, and their very ability to survive in a harsh and unforgiving landscape. The evidence of the creature's activities would begin to accumulate like pieces of a horrifying puzzle. Strange noises would be heard in the night, sounds that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. Villagers would report seeing shadowy figures moving through the streets after midnight, figures that matched the appearance of the recently deceased but moved with an unnatural, predatory grace. Most damning of all would be the discovery of physical tracks, clear footprints in the morning mud or fresh snow that led directly from the cemetery to the doors of the afflicted homes, and then back again. These were not the confused wanderings of a lost spirit, but the purposeful movements of a hunter that knew exactly where to find its prey. Here at Vanishing Legends, we explore these forgotten terrors not just as historical curiosities, but as windows into the deepest fears that have shaped human civilization. If you want to understand how our ancestors made sense of the inexplicable tragedies that befell their communities, you absolutely need to subscribe to this channel right now, because we are only beginning to uncover the layers of horror that surrounded the original Romanian vampire. The mounting evidence of supernatural activity would force the community to confront a terrible reality. All their protective rituals had failed. All their prayers and garlic and crosses had proven insufficient against the monster that walked among them. The whispered fears that had begun in a single household were now spreading through the village like wildfire, and every family began to wonder if they would be the next to feel the icy touch of the undead. But the Strigoi's most devastating attacks were always reserved for those it had known most intimately in life. The creature seemed to retain enough memory of its human existence to know exactly how to cause the maximum emotional and psychological damage to its former loved ones. It would appear in dreams as the person they had mourned, speaking in familiar voices, reminding its victims of shared memories and private jokes, only to reveal its monstrous nature at the moment when their guard was lowest. Children would wake screaming from nightmares in which their deceased parent had beckoned them to come closer, promising comfort and safety before transforming into something terrible and alien. Widows would dream of passionate embraces with their dead husbands, only to wake up feeling weak and violated, marked with bruises they could not explain. The psychological warfare was perhaps more devastating than any physical attack could have been. The Strigoi weaponized love itself, turning the deepest bonds of human affection into instruments of terror and destruction. It forced its victims to question their own memories, to wonder whether the person they had mourned had ever truly existed or had always been a mask worn by something monstrous and predatory. This intimate knowledge made the creature nearly impossible to defend against through conventional means. It knew when family members would be alone, when they would be most vulnerable, when their defenses would be at their weakest. It could mimic the voices of the living to lure victims into dangerous situations, or appear in forms that would make them hesitate just long enough for it to strike. The family found themselves trapped in an escalating nightmare from which there seemed to be no escape. Each night brought new horrors, new violations, new evidence that someone they had loved and trusted in life had been transformed into their greatest enemy in death. The bonds that had once been sources of comfort and strength had become chains that bound them to a monster that would never stop hunting them. As word of the family's plight began to spread through the village, neighbors who had once offered comfort and support began to distance themselves. Fear was contagious in these tight-knit communities, and everyone understood that association with a family marked by the Strigoi could bring the creature's attention to their own homes. The victims found themselves increasingly isolated, abandoned by a community that was too terrified to offer help. This isolation made their situation even more desperate. Without the support of their neighbors, without the protective power of community rituals and shared vigilance, the afflicted family was left to face their supernatural tormentor alone. And in that isolation, watching their loved ones waste away night after night, they would be forced to confront the most horrible truth of all. The person they had mourned was truly gone forever. What walked in their form now was something else entirely, something that remembered just enough of human love to know exactly how to corrupt it into an instrument of destruction. The grieving process that should have brought them peace had been transformed into a waking nightmare that would continue until either they found a way to destroy the monster or it succeeded in destroying them. The terror of the Strigoi was not just in its supernatural powers or its ability to drain life from the living. The true horror lay in its perversion of the most sacred human bonds, its ability to take the love between family members and twist it into something monstrous and predatory. It was a creature that proved that death was not always an ending, that sometimes it was just the beginning of something far worse. In villages across Romania, families lived with the knowledge that their greatest tragedy might only be the prelude to an even greater horror. Every death was potentially the birth of a monster. Every grave was possibly a gateway. Every act of mourning carried with it the terrible possibility that what they buried might one day return to destroy everything they held dear. This was the world that gave birth to the vampire legend, a world where love itself could become a weapon in the hands of the undead, where the bonds between family members could survive death only to be corrupted into chains of supernatural predation. The Strigoi was not just Romania's original vampire, it was humanity's darkest fear given form. The nightmare that what we love most might one day become what destroys us completely. When the whispers turned to accusations, and the accusations became certainty. When the evidence could no longer be ignored, and the fear became unbearable, the village faced its most terrible decision. They would have to violate the most sacred taboo of their society. They would have to dig up the dead, but first, they needed permission from the highest earthly authority they knew. A delegation of the village's most respected members would approach their priest, their faces etched with desperation and terror. They would present their evidence methodically, like prosecutors building a case before an otherworldly tribunal. The wasting sickness that had consumed entire families, the mysterious holes that had appeared in the graveyard earth, the cattle that had ceased giving milk, the crops that withered without explanation. They would implore their spiritual shepherd to lead them in this unholy but necessary task, to perform the sacred rites that would give the tormented soul its final rest. From their perspective, this was not desecration, but salvation, not a violation of God's law, but its ultimate fulfillment. They were asking their priest to help them restore the natural order that had been so terribly disrupted. But here, ancient folklore collided with church doctrine like two immovable forces meeting in the darkness. The priest found himself caught between two worlds, two systems of belief that demanded entirely different responses to the same crisis. As a man who had grown up in these mountains, who had heard the same whispered stories since childhood, he might have shared their fears. Part of him might have believed in the reality of the Strigoi just as deeply as any villager. But as an ordained representative of the church, he answered to bishops and archbishops who lived in distant cities, men of education and theology who viewed these rural beliefs as embarrassing remnants of a pagan past. The official position was clear and uncompromising. The sacraments of the church, prayer and confession and holy water, were the only legitimate weapons against evil. His duty was to calm his flock, to strengthen their faith in God's protection, and to absolutely forbid them from participating in what church doctrine condemned as devilish superstition. This refusal often created a crisis within the community that went far beyond the original supernatural threat. The villagers, already terrorized by the monster in their midst, now felt abandoned by the very institution that was supposed to protect their souls. Their pleas for help transformed into anger, their desperation into rage. The priest, who should have been their greatest ally in this battle against evil, had become another obstacle to overcome. In many documented cases throughout Romanian history, when the priest refused to sanctify their actions, the villagers made a decision that would have been unthinkable under normal circumstances. They chose to proceed without the church's blessing, to take matters into their own hands and perform the terrible ritual according to the ancient customs their ancestors had followed for centuries before Christianity ever reached these mountains. This decision created a bitter schism within communities that had been bound together by shared faith for generations. Families were torn apart by arguments over whether to defy the church. Neighbors who had lived in harmony for decades suddenly found themselves on opposite sides of a theological war. The strigoi had not only brought physical death and supernatural terror to the village, it had shattered the very social bonds that held their world together. But fear, in the end, proved stronger than faith. When children continued to waste away and animals continued to die, when the evidence of supernatural malevolence became overwhelming, the community's survival instinct overrode their religious obedience. They would perform the ancient ritual with or without their priest's blessing, because the alternative was to watch their entire village slowly consumed by an evil they finally understood how to combat. The hunt for the creature's earthly remains could not begin until the villagers solved a crucial problem that had plagued them since the terror first began. In a community where multiple people might have died within a single season, how could they be certain which grave contained the monster? The signs of supernatural activity, the wasting sickness and failed crops and ghostly apparitions, all pointed to the presence of a strigoi, but they provided no clear indication of its identity. Exhuming every recent burial would be an act of mass sacrilege that might damn their own souls even as they tried to save their lives. They needed a method that would identify their target with supernatural precision, a way to let the otherworld itself reveal which of their dead had refused to stay dead. For this most critical task, they turned not to human wisdom, but to the pure instincts of the animal kingdom. They needed a creature whose spiritual sensitivity could detect the presence of evil that human senses could not perceive. The ritual demanded a horse of absolutely pure color, either jet black as the midnight sky or snow white as fresh mountain snow, with not a single hair of any other shade marking its coat. This was not a random superstition, but a carefully developed system based on centuries of accumulated folk wisdom. The pure color was believed to indicate a pure spirit, an animal whose connection to the natural world remained uncontaminated by the corruption that the strigoi brought to everything it touched. Only such a creature could serve as a reliable detector of supernatural evil. The selection of the horse was a solemn process that involved the entire community. Every animal in the village would be examined with the intensity of jewelers studying precious stones. The slightest variation in color, the smallest spot or marking, would disqualify a potential candidate. When the perfect horse was finally found, it would be treated with the reverence due to a sacred instrument, fed the finest hay and oats, groomed until its coat gleamed like polished metal. The ritual itself was a procession that combined elements of funeral march and hunting expedition. The chosen horse would be mounted by a young boy, preferably one who had never known a woman, whose own purity would complement that of his mount. Together, this pair would serve as a supernatural divining rod, capable of detecting evil that remained invisible to adult eyes. The entire village would follow in tense silence as the boy guided his horse slowly through the graveyard, weaving between crooked tombstones and sunken mounds of earth. Their lanterns and torches cast dancing shadows that seemed to take on lives of their own, creating an atmosphere of otherworldly dread that made everyone present feel as if they had already stepped part way into the realm of the dead. The horse would be led methodically over the grave of every person who had died in recent memory, its hooves treading on soil that contained the mortal remains of neighbors, friends, and family members. The villagers watched its every movement with the intensity of scholars studying ancient texts, searching for the telltale signs that would reveal the location of their supernatural enemy. Over most graves, the animal would pass without incident, its steady gait confirming that whatever lay beneath the earth had found the peace that death was meant to bring. But the watchers knew that eventually, inevitably, they would witness something that would chill them to their very souls. When the horse finally approached the grave that contained the strigoi, its behavior would change in ways that no amount of human training could have produced. The animal's natural instincts, honed by millions of years of evolution to detect predators and threats, would suddenly scream warnings that its rider could feel through every fiber of their shared connection. The horse would stop dead in its tracks, its muscles tensing, as if it had encountered an invisible wall of pure malevolence. Its ears would flatten against its skull, its eyes would roll white with terror, and it would begin to back away from the grave with a desperation that communicated itself to every human witness. Often the animal would rear up on its hind legs, pawing at the air as if trying to escape from something that only it could see, something so fundamentally wrong that every instinct it possessed demanded immediate flight. The rider, feeling the animal's terror through his seat and reins, would often be thrown to the ground by the violence of the horse's reaction, but this was not seen as a failure of horsemanship. It was confirmation, the clearest possible sign that they had found what they were looking for. The pure beast had encountered the impure spirit, and its revulsion was proof positive that evil lay buried in the earth beneath their feet. With the grave now identified through supernatural means, the community faced the final and most terrible phase of their ordeal. They would have to commit an act that, under any normal circumstances, would be considered a mortal sin. They would have to violate the sacred resting place of one of their own to dig up and desecrate a human body that had been committed to God's earth with all the proper ceremonies and blessings. But these were not normal circumstances. The natural order had already been violated by the creature that lay beneath the soil, and only by breaking one taboo could they hope to restore the cosmic balance that the strigoi had shattered. The desecration of a grave became not a sin, but a sacred duty, not a crime against God, but an act of divine service. Under the cover of darkness, when even the bravest villagers felt some protection from the shadows that concealed their forbidden work, the men of the community would gather at the marked grave. They came armed with shovels and pickaxes, with ropes and wooden stakes, with all the tools they would need to perform the most terrible ritual their culture had ever devised. The work was backbreaking and slow, made more difficult by the need for absolute secrecy and the weight of dread that pressed down upon them like a physical force. Every scrape of metal against stone seemed to echo through the night air like a scream. Every breath came hard and labored, as if the very atmosphere around the grave had become thick and poisonous. But they persevered, driven by a desperation that made cowards brave and made the unthinkable become inevitable. Hour after hour they dug, taking turns when exhaustion threatened to overwhelm them, until finally they heard the sound they had been waiting for and dreading in equal measure. A dull, hollow thud echoed from the bottom of the pit as a shovel struck weathered wood. They had reached the coffin, the final barrier between them and the truth that lay within. With ropes and raw strength, they would haul the heavy wooden box from its earthly prison and lay it upon the ground beside the violated grave. This was the moment of ultimate revelation, when theory would become terrible fact, when folklore would be proven or disproven by the evidence of their own eyes. The entire village would gather in a circle around the exhumed coffin, their faces pale in the flickering torchlight, their hearts pounding with a fear that went beyond anything they had ever experienced. If you are fascinated by these ancient rituals that our ancestors used to combat supernatural evil, then you absolutely must subscribe to Vanishing Legends right now, because we are about to witness the most horrifying discovery in all of Romanian folklore. And you will not want to miss what happens when that coffin lid is finally opened. The village elder, or perhaps the bravest among them, would approach the coffin with hands that trembled despite his determination. A final prayer would be whispered, a final breath would be held, and then, with the sound of protesting nails and creaking wood, The lid would be pried away from the box that had been meant to contain the dead for eternity. What they saw inside would either confirm their worst fears or plunge them into even deeper confusion and terror. For the body of a strigoi did not look like the body of any normal corpse, and the signs they had been taught to recognize would be unmistakably present for all to see. The first and most shocking discovery was always the state of preservation. In a world without embalming, without any artificial means of preventing decay, a body that had been buried weeks or even months earlier should have been in an advanced state of decomposition. But the corpse of a strigoi defied all natural law. Instead of the skeletal remains or rotting flesh they expected to find, the villagers would discover a body that appeared almost healthier in death than it had been in life. The skin would be ruddy and lifelike, the limbs supple and flexible rather than stiff with rigor mortis. The corpse might even appear plumper, more robust than it had been at the moment of death, as if it had been feeding and growing stronger in its grave. To the terrified witnesses, this unnatural preservation was not a miracle, but a curse, clear evidence that the body was being sustained by malevolent supernatural forces. They would look for other damning signs that their folklore had taught them to recognize. The eyes would often be found wide open, staring up from the coffin with an alertness that no dead person should possess. The hair and fingernails would appear to have grown since burial, another violation of natural law that proved the creature's unnatural state. Most horrifying of all, they would often discover fresh, liquid blood on the lips and in the mouth of the corpse, or pooled at the bottom of the coffin like some ghastly wine. This blood was seen as the ultimate proof of the creature's nocturnal activities, evidence that it had been leaving its grave to feed on the living, sustaining its unholy existence with the life force it stole from its former loved ones. Sometimes they would find that the burial shroud had been chewed and torn from the inside, a sign that the hungry creature had begun by consuming its own grave clothes before moving on to prey upon the living. All of these signs, viewed through the lens of centuries-old folklore, painted a single, undeniable picture. This was no longer their friend, their family member, their neighbor. This was a monster, a parasitic shell, animated by a malevolent spirit that remembered just enough of human form to make its violation of natural law even more horrifying. The evidence lay before them, impossible to deny or explain away. The time for doubt was over. The moment for action had arrived. They had found their monster, and now they would have to destroy it before it could claim any more victims from among the living. The community gathered around the open coffin had reached the point of no return. They had violated sacred ground, defied church authority, and confirmed their worst fears about the supernatural evil that walked among them. Now they faced the final and most terrible task of all. They would have to perform the second killing, a ritual designed not just to destroy a body, but to utterly annihilate the malevolent soul that had refused to depart when death first claimed it. The most famous of these destructive rites, known throughout the world thanks to countless horror films and novels, was the driving of a wooden stake through the creature's heart. But in its original context, this was not a simple act of violence or a dramatic flourish designed to entertain audiences. It was a precisely calibrated ritual based on centuries of accumulated supernatural wisdom. The choice of wood for the stake was crucial to the ritual's success. It could not be just any piece of timber, but had to be cut from trees that possessed specific sacred properties. Ash wood was favored for its association with protection against evil spirits. Hawthorn was prized for its thorns, which were believed to cause supernatural pain to creatures of darkness. Wild rose was chosen for its connection to purity and divine love, forces that the corrupted strigoi could not withstand. The stake itself had to be carved and shaped according to ancient specifications, its point sharp enough to penetrate flesh and bone, its length sufficient to pin the corpse firmly to the earth beneath. This was not merely a weapon, but a sacred instrument, a tool that would serve both physical and spiritual purposes in the battle against the undead. The actual staking was performed with the solemnity of a religious ceremony. The villager chosen for this terrible honor would position the point of the stake directly over the creature's heart, the organ that had once pumped blood through living veins, but now served as the focal point of supernatural evil. With a single, decisive blow from a heavy mallet, the stake would be driven deep into the chest, piercing the heart and continuing down until it embedded itself in the earth below. The moment of impact would often produce effects that confirm the supernatural nature of their enemy. The corpse would emit sounds that seemed impossible for something that should have been long dead, groans and sighs that suggested a conscious awareness of what was being done to it. Fresh blood would often gush from the wound, far more than any naturally preserved corpse should have contained, sometimes spraying the assembled villagers with crimson evidence of the creature's unnatural state. But staking alone was rarely considered sufficient to ensure the monster's permanent destruction. The accumulated wisdom of generations had taught these communities that a creature capable of defying death itself required multiple forms of destruction to guarantee that it could never return. The next step was decapitation, usually performed with the sharp edge of a shovel or an axe that had been blessed by whatever religious authority was available. This severing of the head from the body was seen as the definitive way to break the connection between the animating spirit and its physical vessel. Without this connection, the malevolent soul would be unable to control or inhabit the corpse, leaving it truly dead at last. The severed head was never simply discarded or reburied with the body. It was often placed between the corpse's feet or buried in a separate location, sometimes miles away from the original grave. This geographic separation was designed to ensure that even if some fragment of supernatural power remained, the head and body could never be rejoined to create a whole monster once again. Additional precautions were taken to bind and neutralize any lingering evil. Cloves of garlic would be stuffed into the mouth of the decapitated corpse, not just as a deterrent, but as a spiritual purifier that would cleanse the body of any remaining supernatural taint. The corpse would sometimes be turned face down in its coffin, so that if any vestige of unnatural life tried to reassert itself, the creature would find itself digging deeper into the earth, rather than toward the surface and the world of the living. These mutilations and precautions, horrifying as they might seem to modern sensibilities, were performed with the reverence due to sacred rituals. The villagers understood that they were not merely destroying a body, but performing a kind of exorcism, driving out a malevolent spirit that had claimed territory that rightfully belonged to God and nature. But even these extreme measures were not the end of the ritual. The ultimate purification, the final guarantee of the creature's destruction, could only come through the cleansing power of fire. The heart that had been pierced by the wooden stake would be carefully cut from the chest of the corpse, this grotesque trophy representing the very core of the monster's supernatural existence. This organ, still believed to contain the concentrated essence of the creature's evil, would be carried to a crossroads at the stroke of midnight. Crossroads were chosen for this final ritual because they were considered to be places where the boundaries between worlds were naturally thin, locations where supernatural forces could be safely channeled and disposed of without contaminating the surrounding area. A pyre would be built from sacred woods, often the same types that had been used to craft the stake. The heart would be placed at the center of this funeral fire and burned until nothing remained but fine black ash. The flames were believed to not only destroy the physical organ, but to consume the spiritual corruption it contained, reducing the creature's evil to harmless residue. This ash, paradoxically, became the final ingredient in the cure for the Strigoi's victims. The fine black powder would be carefully collected from the cooling embers and mixed with clean water drawn from the village well or a sacred spring. This mixture, containing the last remnant of the monster's power, would then be taken to the homes of those who had suffered from the creature's attacks. Every family member who had experienced the wasting sickness, the night terrors, or the mysterious decline that marked them as victims of supernatural predation would be given this macabre medicine to drink. In the logic of folk magic, this represented the ultimate victory over evil. By consuming the very essence of the creature that had been draining their life force, they would not only neutralize its power, but reclaim the vitality it had stolen from them. The ritual was complete. The monster's body had been pinned to the earth with sacred wood, its head severed and separated, its heart consumed by purifying fire, and its victims healed with its own transformed essence. The natural order had been restored through the most unnatural means imaginable, and the community could finally rest knowing that their supernatural tormentor had been destroyed forever. But the memory of what they had done, what they had been forced to do, would linger long after the last ashes were scattered and the violated grave was filled. They had learned that death was not always an ending, that love could be corrupted into predation, and that sometimes the most sacred taboos had to be broken in order to preserve the sanctity of life itself. The hunt was over. The monster was destroyed. But the knowledge of what lay buried in human nature, the understanding that any of them might one day return as something monstrous, would haunt these mountain communities for generations to come. They had faced the darkness that lived at the heart of their own mortality, and they had emerged victorious. But victory, they learned, was not the same as peace. The Strigoi was dead, truly dead at last. But the legend it had created, the terror it had inspired, and the rituals it had demanded would outlive every person who had witnessed its destruction. In defeating their monster, they had created something even more powerful and enduring. They had created a myth that would one day conquer the world. The destruction of the Strigoi marked the end of one nightmare, but it was also the beginning of something far more complex and enduring. As we look back across the centuries from our modern vantage point, we can begin to see how this ancient Romanian terror would eventually transform into something the world had never seen before. The creature that had once stalked the villages of the Carpathian Mountains was about to undergo a metamorphosis that would make it immortal in ways its original form could never have achieved. The folklore of the Strigoi, with all its intimate horror and supernatural dread, might have remained forever locked in the mountain valleys of Romania, known only to the communities that had lived and died by its terrible rules. But history had other plans. The expanding Austrian Empire, with its rational bureaucrats and educated administrators, was about to encounter these ancient beliefs in ways that would change everything. When imperial officials like Frombald and Johannes Flukinger documented their investigations into vampire activities in Serbian villages, they were doing more than just filing reports. They were translating a complex, deeply rooted folk belief system into the language of Enlightenment reason. Their clinical, medical descriptions of supernatural phenomena created something entirely new. A vampire that could be discussed in the salons of Vienna and Paris, debated by philosophers and theologians, analyzed through the lens of emerging scientific method. These official reports, with their careful documentation of uncorrupted corpses and fresh blood in ancient graves, gave the Strigoi something it had never possessed before: credibility in the wider world. The creature that had once been dismissed as peasant superstition now had the backing of imperial surgeons and military investigators. It had been legitimized, sanitized, and prepared for export to a European audience hungry for exotic mysteries. But the true transformation was yet to come. The Strigoi was about to encounter something that would change its nature forever: the Gothic imagination. When writers like John Polidori and eventually Bram Stoker discovered these Eastern European legends, they found raw material that was perfect for their literary purposes. But they also found something they needed to reshape completely: the intimate, family-destroying horror of the original Strigoi was too personal, too rooted in specific cultural beliefs to translate directly into popular fiction. Victorian audiences wanted their monsters to be exotic and distant, not reminders of their own mortality and the potential for evil within their own households. They wanted elegant aristocrats in remote castles, not reanimated neighbours crawling from local graveyards. And so the Strigoi underwent its final, most dramatic transformation. It was stripped of its connection to specific burial practices and folk beliefs. It lost its intimate knowledge of family dynamics and community structures. It was removed from its natural habitat among the tight-knit villages of Romania and relocated to Gothic castles and aristocratic drawing rooms. In this process, the creature gained sophistication, elegance, and sexual appeal. But it lost something far more important: its terrifying authenticity. The vampire that emerged from this literary evolution was undeniably more commercially successful than its ancestor, but it was also fundamentally less frightening because it was fundamentally less real. The Strigoi had been born from genuine human experiences of loss, grief, disease, and community trauma. It represented real fears about death, decay, and the possibility that our loved ones might return to harm us. The literary vampire, no matter how compelling, could never match that primal terror because it was a product of imagination rather than lived experience. Yet in conquering the world through literature, film, and popular culture, the transformed vampire carried within it the DNA of its Romanian ancestor. Every time a modern audience feels a chill at the thought of the undead, every time someone hangs garlic for protection or makes the sign of the cross against evil, they are participating in a ritual that began in the mountain villages of medieval Romania. The success of the modern vampire myth has been so complete that it has almost entirely obscured its origins. Most people who know the name Dracula have never heard of the Strigoi. They can describe the elegant count with his cape and aristocratic manners, but they have no knowledge of the shambling, earth-stained creature that clawed its way from Romanian graves to drain the life from sleeping families. This represents both a triumph and a tragedy. The triumph is obvious. A piece of Romanian folklore has achieved global recognition and cultural impact beyond anything its creators could have imagined. The Strigoi, in its transformed state, has become one of the most recognizable monsters in human history, inspiring countless works of art, literature, and entertainment. The tragedy is more subtle, but equally profound. In becoming universally known, the vampire has become universally misunderstood. Its transformation from folklore to fiction has severed its connection to the real human experiences that gave it birth. The profound psychological insights embedded in the original legends, the sophisticated understanding of grief and community trauma, the complex rituals developed to address supernatural threats, all of this has been lost in translation. Modern vampire fiction, for all its entertainment value, rarely captures the intimate horror of the Strigoi's attacks on family members, the devastating impact of supernatural predation on tight-knit communities, or the terrible necessity of performing rituals that violated every moral and religious principle the villagers held sacred. These elements were too specific, too culturally rooted, too genuinely disturbing to survive the journey from folklore to popular culture. But perhaps there is hope for recovering something of what has been lost. In an age where we are rediscovering the value of traditional knowledge systems, where we are learning to appreciate the sophisticated insights embedded in folk practices, there may be room for a renewed appreciation of the original Strigoi and the culture that created it. The Romanian vampire was never just a monster. It was a complex response to universal human experiences, the pain of loss, the fear of disease, the struggle to maintain community bonds in the face of tragedy, the need to find explanations for inexplicable suffering. These concerns are as relevant today as they were in medieval Romania, even if we express them through different cultural forms. By understanding the Strigoi in its original context, we can gain insights not just into Romanian folklore, but into the fundamental human need to create stories that help us process our deepest fears and most difficult experiences. The creature that terrorized Carpathian villages was ultimately a creation of human imagination, but it was an imagination wrestling with very real problems. How do we cope with the death of loved ones? How do we explain the spread of disease through communities? How do we maintain social bonds when trust has been shattered by tragedy? These questions remain as pressing today as they were centuries ago, even if we approach them through different means. The modern world has largely replaced supernatural explanations with scientific ones, but we have not eliminated the underlying human experiences that gave birth to legends like the Strigoi. We still struggle with grief, still fear the unknown, still seek explanations for suffering that seems random and meaningless. In this light, the Strigoi emerges not as a relic of primitive superstition, but as a sophisticated attempt to address universal human concerns through the symbolic language of folklore. The rituals developed to combat it were not mere barbaric practices, but carefully constructed responses to community trauma, designed to restore social bonds and provide psychological closure for those who had suffered supernatural attack. The story of Romania's original vampire is ultimately a story about human resilience, about communities that refused to be destroyed by forces they could not understand or control. When faced with inexplicable tragedy, they created explanations. When confronted with supernatural terror, they developed countermeasures. When their world was torn apart by forces beyond their comprehension, they found ways to put it back together. The Strigoi may have been a creature of darkness, but the human response to it was ultimately one of light. The villagers who faced these monsters did not simply cower in fear or accept their fate passively. They organized, they planned, they took action. They developed complex systems of protection and elaborate rituals of destruction. They turned their terror into determination and their helplessness into agency. This is perhaps the most important lesson we can learn from the legend of the Strigoi. It is not a story about the power of evil, but about the power of human communities to confront evil and emerge victorious. It is not a tale of supernatural inevitability, but of human choice and human courage in the face of impossible odds. The villages that defeated their monsters did so not through superior firepower or advanced technology, but through cooperation, shared knowledge, and collective action. They succeeded because they refused to face their demons alone, because they drew strength from their community bonds, because they trusted in traditions that had been tested and refined over generations. In our modern world, where traditional communities have been weakened and ancient knowledge systems have been largely abandoned, there may be wisdom in looking back to see how our ancestors dealt with their own monsters. We may not face literal vampires rising from graves, but we still confront forces that threaten to destroy what we hold most dear. We still need ways to process grief, explain suffering, and restore hope when all seems lost. The Strigoi is dead, destroyed by wooden stakes and purifying fire in mountain graveyards centuries ago. But the human needs it represented, the fears it embodied, and the courage required to face it live on in every generation. In understanding Romania's original vampire, we understand something essential about ourselves: that we are capable of creating both monsters and the means to destroy them, that we can transform our deepest fears into sources of strength, and that even in our darkest moments, we are never truly alone. The legend of the Strigoi reminds us that every monster we create is ultimately a mirror, reflecting our own anxieties and aspirations back at us in distorted form. By facing these creatures honestly, by understanding where they come from and what they represent, we gain the power to transform them from sources of terror into sources of insight. This is the final gift of Romania's original vampire. Not just a thrilling tale of supernatural horror, but a profound meditation on human nature, community resilience, and the eternal struggle between the forces that would destroy us and our determination to survive and thrive despite them all. The Strigoi may have given birth to Dracula, but Dracula could never have given birth to the Strigoi. One was a creature of authentic human experience, the other a product of literary imagination. One emerged from the soil of lived reality, the other from the fertile ground of Gothic fiction. Both have their place in the story of human culture, but only one can claim to be the true original. The authentic voice of an ancient fear that shaped the lives of countless generations. Thank you for joining us here at Vanishing Legends on this journey into the darkest corners of Romanian folklore. If you found yourself captivated by this exploration of humanity's most primal fears, if you want to continue discovering the forgotten stories that shaped our modern world, then you absolutely must subscribe to this channel right now. We have so much more to uncover together, so many more shadows to illuminate, so many more legends to rescue from the vanishing mists of time. The story of the Strigoi is just one thread in the vast tapestry of human mythology, but it is a thread that connects us directly to our ancestors' deepest fears and greatest triumphs. By understanding where our monsters come from, we better understand where we ourselves come from, and perhaps most importantly, where we might be going. The vampire may live forever in popular culture, but the Strigoi lives forever in the human heart, reminding us that sometimes the most powerful truths are found not in what we choose to remember, but in what we have chosen to forget.